In the early hours of April 18, 1906, San Francisco was asleep, not in peace, but in confidence. A booming city of electric lights and cable cars, proud hills, grand hotels, and crowded wooden neighborhoods. It had survived storms, fires, and corruption. It had money in its banks, ambition in its streets, and momentum in its bones. And then the ground snapped. At 5:12 a.m., the city was ripped awake by a violent jolt that felt less like shaking and more like being thrown. Buildings groaned. Brick walls peeled apart like paper. Chimneys collapsed in cascading avalanches. Streetcar lines whipped and sparked. The earth rolled in waves through the avenues, and the sound, that sound survivors never forgot, was a deep, grinding roar, like the city itself was tearing open from underneath. This was the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. But the earthquake was only the opening act. The true killer, the event that would erase entire neighborhoods from the map, was the fire that came after. Because in a modern city, disaster is rarely a single blow. It's a chain reaction, a domino effect. And in San Francisco, the first domino wasn't the collapse of a building. It was a pipe. When the quake struck, it didn't just crack walls and topple roofs. It ruptured the hidden arteries of the city. The gas mains running under streets, the water pipes feeding hydrants, the electrical lines feeding the skyline. Underground infrastructure, the invisible system that made a modern city function, snapped in dozens of places at once. Gas lines broke open like severed veins, and in the dark, as families stumbled out of their homes in night clothes, gas began to hiss into basements, into alleys, into the air itself. Then came the sparks. Some were accidental. A knocked over stove, a shattered lantern, a severed electrical wire snapping against metal. Some were inevitable, because a city filled with gas, broken glass, and exposed flame is not a question of if, it's only where first. Within minutes, small fires began to appear across the city. Not one fire, not 2 dozens. At first, many residents didn't understand what they were seeing. The earthquake had passed. The shaking had slowed. People clung to the hope that the worst was over. They stepped into the streets, hearts pounding, watching dust clouds drift from collapsed masonry. Then a glow appeared in the distance, a thin orange ribbon, a single building burning, and then another and another. San Francisco's geography, those famous hills, became cruel amplifiers. Flames climbed upward faster than men could run. Wind funneled through narrow streets. Wooden homes, packed tightly together, turned blocks into kindling. Entire neighborhoods were built like tinder stacks, dry lumber, tar roofs, and narrow gaps between buildings that let fire leap from house to house like an animal. But the most devastating reality was this: San Francisco couldn't fight the fire because the water was gone. The earthquake had shattered the city's water mains. Hydrants stood like useless monuments. Firefighters dragged hoses into the streets and opened valves, only to hear air cough out of the lines. No pressure, no flow, no water. Imagine the psychological horror of that moment. A fire crew trained for one job, facing a citywide blaze, with empty hoses in their hands. In 1906, firefighting was already a difficult art. There were no helicopters, no modern foam, no coordinated emergency response grid. The city's fire department had brave men and strong horses, but it did not have what it needed most: reliable water and unified command. And now, San Francisco was burning from multiple points at once. This wasn't a single inferno you could surround and suffocate. It was a wildfire made of streets. As dawn rose over the bay, the smoke thickened into a ceiling. Ash drifted like gray snow. The sun became a dull coin behind the haze. People gathered in parks and open squares, clutching children, blankets, jewelry, anything they could carry. Some pushed wheelbarrows loaded with their entire lives. Others carried nothing at all, because their homes were already gone. Across the city, the fires began to merge. One blaze consumed a block, then 2 blocks, then 10. Fire does not respect property lines. It does not negotiate. It does not tire. And in San Francisco, the conditions were perfect for a monster. Broken gas mains fed the flames like fuel lines. Wind spread embers onto rooftops like thrown matches, and collapsing buildings created new paths for the fire to run. Soon, the disaster evolved into something far worse than the quake itself. The earthquake had lasted less than a minute. The fire would last for days. The city tried to respond with what it had. Firefighters attempted to create fire breaks by demolishing buildings ahead of the flames. They pulled down structures with ropes and teams of men. They used axes. They used hooks. They used raw desperation. The idea was simple. If you remove the fuel, the fire has nothing to eat. But this wasn't a controlled burn. This was a storm of flame. Even when a building came down, the fire simply found another route. It crawled through attics. It traveled along fences. It leapt across streets on gusts of wind. Burning embers rode the air like glowing insects, landing blocks away and starting new blazes in places that had been untouched moments before. It was as if the city was being attacked by an enemy that could teleport, and the people were trapped inside the logic of modern infrastructure. Gas without control, electricity without stability, water without pressure. By mid-morning, entire districts were lost. The downtown commercial core, the pride of the city, began to buckle. Hotels burned like torches. Warehouses exploded with stored goods. The financial district, built of brick and stone, cracked and collapsed under the heat. And then came the decision that would become one of the most infamous choices in urban disaster history. They would use dynamite. The logic sounded heroic, even scientific. If you couldn't stop the fire with water, you could stop it by removing the buildings. Make a fire break, blow up a line of structures, create an empty corridor the flames couldn't cross. It had been done before, in smaller fires, under different conditions. And in theory, it could work. But theory does not survive panic, because dynamite is not a scalpel, it's a hammer. And San Francisco was not stable enough for precision. The streets were cracked. Buildings were already weakened. Gas was leaking underground. The air itself was full of heat, smoke, and flying embers. Communication between teams was chaotic. There was no clear, unified command with modern coordination. Decisions were made in urgency, in confusion, with limited information, and a rapidly moving threat. When the dynamite charges went off, they did not create clean fire breaks. They created shockwaves. They shattered windows. They knocked down already damaged walls. They sprayed burning debris into the air like shrapnel. And worst of all, they opened buildings to oxygen. Fire needs fuel, heat, and air. The dynamite gave it air in abundance. Instead of stopping the blaze, many explosions fed it. They turned intact buildings into broken piles of dry lumber. They created new surfaces for fire to spread across. They sent embers flying into the wind. In some cases, the dynamite itself ignited fires. A decision meant to save the city began to accelerate its destruction. And while officials argued over strategy, the fire kept moving, block by block, hill by hill, as if it had its own plan. By the afternoon, the situation had become almost biblical. People watched from open ground as a skyline of smoke swallowed their city. Church spires disappeared. Landmarks vanished behind black curtains. The soundscape became constant crackling flames, collapsing beams, distant explosions, and the endless screaming of steam and gas escaping broken pipes. San Francisco was not just burning, it was being erased. The most terrifying part was the realization that there was no single front line anymore. The fire was everywhere. It advanced in multiple directions, driven by wind, fueled by broken infrastructure, and fed by the density of the urban grid. And as the hours passed, a new fear spread faster than the flames. Not everyone would escape. Hospitals were damaged. Streets were blocked by rubble. Families were separated in the chaos. Some people were trapped in collapsing buildings. Others ran into dead ends where fire cut off the streets ahead. And in the crush of evacuation, with smoke thick in the lungs and ash stinging the eyes, the city turned into a maze of heat. By nightfall, the glow could be seen for miles across the bay. The fire lit the clouds from below, turning them orange and red like a permanent sunset. The city looked like it was sitting inside a furnace. And in the darkness, thousands of people camped in parks, on beaches, in open fields, listening to the roar of their city burning. They didn't know what would be left in the morning. They didn't know if the fire would stop. They didn't know if the ground would shake again. All they knew was that the disaster had become something bigger than an earthquake. It had become a system failure, a chain reaction of urban life collapsing in real time. And the dominoes were still falling. By the second day, San Francisco wasn't fighting a fire anymore. It was fighting a moving border of annihilation. The quake had cracked the city open, but the fire had become the thing that traveled, street to street, block to block, turning the disaster into a living map of collapse. If you could have looked down from the sky that morning, you wouldn't have seen one blaze. You would have seen multiple firestorms, separate at first, then merging like rivers of flame. And the reason it spread the way it did was brutally simple. San Francisco was built to burn. Much of the city was wood. Even in wealthier districts, many structures had wooden interiors. Timber framing, tar roofing, and dry, old materials that had never been tested by a true urban inferno. Narrow streets packed buildings tightly together, so close that heat alone could ignite the next block. And once the flames reached a critical intensity, they no longer needed a match. They became their own ignition source. This is where the domino effect becomes clear. In an urban disaster, the first failure isn't always the deadliest. The first failure is the one that disables the system, meant to stop the next failure. The earthquake didn't just cause fires. It crippled the city's ability to contain them. Broken water mains meant firefighters were suddenly reduced to spectators with uniforms. They could pull people from rubble. They could try to slow the edges. But they couldn't do what mattered most: flood the heat with pressure and volume. Hydrants became metal statues. Hose lines became useless snakes dragged through smoke. And the fire understood that weakness immediately. It found the densest districts first, the areas where heat could bounce between walls, where roofs were close enough for embers to hop across like stepping stones. It raced up slopes, because flame climbs faster than it spreads on flat ground. It moved through the city's veins, alleyways, wooden staircases, attic spaces, and storefront awnings. Then it found the fuel, gas mains, already cracked and leaking, continued feeding pockets of flame. In places, the city itself was acting like a blowtorch. You could shut down the gas in one area, but the infrastructure was fractured, the valves were hard to reach, and communication was chaos. Even when people did the right thing, they did it too late or without coordination. And every hour that passed made the fire more powerful. Because fire isn't just heat, fire is momentum. Once it grows large enough, it creates its own wind. It pulls oxygen into itself like a breathing creature. It throws embers outward, like seeds. That's when the disaster shifted from many fires into something far more terrifying, a firestorm. In the worst zones, the air became a weapon. Hot winds pushed the flames forward, sucked fresh oxygen into the core, and carried burning debris over rooftops. People described the sound like a freight train. Others said it was like standing next to a furnace door that never closed. And then the city's most desperate tactic returned again and again: dynamite. The decision wasn't made by villains. It was made by people trying to save anything from total erasure. Forests don't have gas lines. Forests don't have basements full of coal and oil. Forests don't have broken brick walls ready to collapse into piles of dry kindling. When dynamite was used in San Francisco, it often did the opposite of what was intended. The blasts tore open structures and exposed fresh surfaces to oxygen. They shattered buildings into flammable debris. They launched sparks and embers into the air. They knocked down adjacent walls, widening the fire's buffet instead of denying it fuel. Even worse, the men handling explosives weren't always trained demolition experts. Some were soldiers, some were volunteers, some were simply desperate. Charges were placed too close, too large, too fast. A plan meant to cut a clean line turned into a series of uncontrolled ruptures across already wounded neighborhoods. The fire didn't just cross the gaps, it ate them. At times, the dynamite blasts created new fires instantly. Not because the explosive itself was magical, but because the city was saturated with ignition sources, leaking gas, glowing embers, exposed wiring, and heat so intense it could ignite wood without direct flame. The tragedy of it is hard to overstate. The very act of trying to stop the fire became one of the ways the fire grew. Meanwhile, the human story unfolded at street level, and it was raw. Tens of thousands became refugees in their own city. They moved in waves, carrying what they could. Families pushed carts loaded with bedding and food. Men carried mirrors, trunks, sewing machines, bird cages, anything that felt like a piece of their life. Some tried to save furniture. Others carried only a photograph, a Bible, or a single coat. You can measure the scale of disaster in buildings lost, but you feel it in what people choose to carry. The city's open spaces became temporary nations. Golden Gate Park, the Presidio, Dolores Park, and beaches along the waterfront filled with tents, blankets, and improvised shelters. Fires painted the horizon red. Ash fell onto campfires. The air smelled of smoke and wet wool and fear. And all around them, San Francisco kept collapsing, not just structurally, socially. Food supplies became uncertain. Water was scarce. Hospitals overflowed. Rumors spread faster than official messages. Some people believed more quakes were coming. Others believed the city would burn to the bay and keep going. There were reports of looting, and with those reports came another failure mode of disaster. Panic-driven authority. Soldiers were deployed. Martial law was rumored, if not formally declared in a modern legal sense. Still, amid the chaos, there were acts of discipline and courage. Firefighters continued working with what little they had. Citizens formed bucket brigades where water could be found. People guided strangers through smoke-filled streets. Doctors treated injuries in makeshift clinics. Priests and nurses moved among the camps. And on the waterfront, boats ferried evacuees across the bay, away from a city that looked like it had been struck by war. By the third day, the fire had consumed so much fuel that parts of it began to starve. Entire districts were simply gone, nothing left to burn but chimneys standing like gravestones. The fire's path had carved emptiness into the urban grid blocks, reduced to ash fields and twisted iron. It was only then, only after the city had been sacrificed, that the flames began to weaken, and when the smoke finally started to thin, San Francisco emerged into a kind of stunned silence. The earthquake had shattered it. The fire had hollowed it out. The numbers were staggering. Hundreds of thousands displaced, vast sections of the city destroyed, and a death toll that will never be fully known with perfect certainty. But beyond numbers, the visual reality was unmistakable. Entire neighborhoods had vanished. Familiar streets no longer existed. The skyline was altered. The city had been forcibly redesigned by heat. This is the moment where many disaster stories end. But the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire doesn't end with smoke. Because the most important consequence wasn't just the destruction, it was the lesson. San Francisco became one of the first modern case studies in cascading urban failure, a warning written in ash about what happens when infrastructure breaks in sequence. Earthquake, gas rupture, ignition, water failure, fire spread, tactical collapse, mass displacement, a domino chain. And out of that chain came changes that would echo far beyond California. Building practices evolved. Engineering standards hardened. The science of seismology gained urgency. Cities began to understand that the hidden systems, water mains, gas lines, electrical grids were not background details. They were life support machines. Because in an earthquake, the shaking is the headline, but the secondary disasters are often the body count. San Francisco rebuilt. Of course it did. Cities are stubborn. They grow back like forests after a burn. But the rebuilt city carried scars in its planning, in its architecture, and in its memory. Insurance industries changed. Municipal policies changed. Fire codes tightened. And the world learned, painfully, that a city's survival depends not only on strong buildings, but on strong systems. If the quake had been the only event, San Francisco would have been wounded, but it might have recovered quickly. It was the fire, the unstoppable consequence of broken infrastructure, that made it legendary. And here's the uncomfortable truth that makes this story feel modern. We still live in cities of dominoes. We still depend on systems we can't see. Supply chains stretching beyond the horizon. And when one fails, the next one often follows. San Francisco, 110,000 tragedy of nature. It was a tragedy of connectivity of a city built for growth, but not built for failure. The ground moved, the pipes broke, the flames spread. And a metropolis learned, in the harshest way possible, that disaster is rarely a single event. It's a cascade. Anyways, I'm Hooper, watching the past so we can understand the present. And together, we keep history reborn. I'll see you in the next era.